Good afternoon. So we're going to pick up where we left off. All right, we covered the innervation of the lungs. All right, and we are going to start moving on to a little bit more of the anatomy of the lungs that is more related to its physiology and function in breathing. All right, we're going to get into a physiology today. So before we do that, let's finish up a little bit of the anatomy. Right, the coverings of the lungs. Lungs, like any other organ, are covered, all right, by an outside epithelial tissue, especially the lungs, because they are covered with a serous membrane, a serosa, right? It covers the outer surface because the lungs are within the thoracic cavity and they move, right? So the lungs move, the serous membrane actually helps the lungs stay attached to, and I use air quotes with that because they're not like physically attached, but they are kind of stuck to the inner surface of the thoracic cavity. Okay, so you have two pleural membranes, right? That's the name of the serous membrane that cover the lungs and within the thoracic cavity. All right, so we have the visceral pleura, which cover each lung itself. Okay, and it's an epithelial tissue that produces serous fluid. Okay, and the parietal pleura is a membrane that lines the wall of the thoracic cavity. Both of these membranes produce a fluid, a serous fluid, which is mostly water. Okay, that mostly water. Oh, you got it back, huh? So the pleural fluid fills the space between the lung and the thoracic cavity, or the wall of the thoracic cavity, so that basically there's two pieces of tissue that are separated by a very thin, very small layer of liquid or fluid. Okay, what that does, it produces surface tension. Okay, and it allows those two pieces of membrane, remember one being the outer surface of the lung, to stay coherent, right? Meaning that they're somewhat attached, right? Loosely attached, no physical attachment, but the watery fluid between them is keeping them together. Okay? And it allows gliding. So as the lungs inflate, the parietal pleura, right, covers the lining of the wall of the thoracic cavity, and the visceral pleura covers the lung, so they can move kind of across one another like this, right? But they don't necessarily separate in a horizontal fashion away from one another, okay? Because of the serous fluid that's there. That is very important because when you break that separation, whether by air or blood or something else, what happens to the lungs? When you separate out that interpleural pressure that's there created by the serous fluid, the lungs can collapse. Okay, so they resist being pulled apart, and it's a function in how the lungs are ventilated. We'll talk about that today. Okay, so how do the lungs remain inflated is somewhat related to that serous fluid. Okay, that serous fluid helps resist and helps prevent the lungs from separating from the thoracic cavity. Okay? The other part of that is intrapleural pressure. The pressure between those two membranes. It is low. Okay? It's low. So it's supposed to be below what we call intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure within the lungs themselves. Okay? It should be lower than that so the lungs can stay inflated. Okay? So the lungs cling to the chest wall due to surface tension, and there's an elasticity of the tissue which pulls it inward. Okay? So when you inhale, the diaphragm is contracting and moving, flattening, and pushing the thoracic cavity out, right? And the thoracic cavity increases in volume and in space, and as that increases in volume and space, it pulls the lungs with it because of the surface tension between the intrapleural membrane, right? The interpleural membranes. Okay, that surface tension, so the lung is pulled with it, creating a negative pressure within the lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure, I just spit all over the place, excuse me, sorry, right, becomes negative or below atmosphere, and air is pulled into the lungs, okay? That's written wrong. What's wrong with this statement right here at the bottom? Because intrapulmonary pressure in alveoli is greater than intrapulmonary pressure, lungs remain inflated. What should this be? Intrapleural pressure. Must have been late typing those. Okay? Questions on the relationship between intrapulmonary pressure, interpleural pressure, intrapleural pressure, all right, and serous fluid. Okay, so here's the pleural cavity and the pressures associated with lungs. Where the parietal and the visceral pleural are, there is a small space between them. Is it really a space? No, because it's actually filled with serous fluid, and the coherence, the ability of water molecule to adhere to different membranes allows those two membranes to adhere to one another. So they're coherent. They're kind of stuck, but not stuck. Not a permanent attachment, not a physical attachment, but they are stuck together. Okay? I like to describe it as two pieces of paper. Okay? If you take two pieces of paper and they're dry, you can separate them apart, right? Pretty easily, right? And they glide left, right? You can separate them apart. Yes? Okay. But if they were wet, those two pieces of paper were wet and you stuck them together, how hard is it to pull them apart? Can you easily slide them and pull them apart? No, you have to like meticulously pull them apart and then separate them, right, separately from the corners per se. Because the surface tension of water is actually sticking those two pieces of paper together. Okay? And that's the same thing or similar thing that's happening here with the pleural cavities and the pleural membranes. Okay? Questions on that? Now, each lung themselves has a separate pleural membrane. So if there is ever a problem, a situation where there's a disruption in the pleural cavity and there's an opening and the pressure within here goes down, one lung collapses or separates from the thoracic wall and closes, but the other one does not, okay, because they have separate pleural membranes. All right, questions on that? So that kind of lays the groundwork for how the lungs function, okay? And really there are 4 events of respiration, right? What would I say was the primary goal of the lungs? What's the primary function of the lungs? To do what? Alex? Gas exchange. Deliver oxygen to tissues. Okay? But to do that, there's a couple steps you have to get through. Number 1, we have to get air in and out. Okay? Number 2, we have to get air or oxygen into the blood. Then we have to transport the blood from the lungs to the rest of the tissues, and then unload the oxygen from the blood to the tissue. Okay? So those 4 steps, there's actually these 4 steps involved. Number 1 is pulmonary ventilation, moving air in and out. Okay? Commonly that's called what you call as breathing. Okay? Pulmonary ventilation. So we're going to move air in and out. And as we move air in, within the alveoli, we start external respiration. External respiration. It's external because the air has not passed any cells and has not been internalized within the body. Okay? Yes, it's internal, it's within the lungs, but it's not past any cells, so it's still outside air. Okay? So this external respiration refers to the gas exchange between the alveoli, and the blood. Okay? So oxygen is loaded into the blood and carbon dioxide is loaded from the blood. What do we know about that process? So here's the alveolus, okay? And here's a blood vessel. What separates these two? What do we say that was? What do we call that? Okay, you have 15 seconds to look it up. Taylor, respiratory membrane. Okay? So you have your respiratory membrane, okay, which is consisted of the simple squamous epithelial tissue, a basement membrane that those cells adhere to, and then the endothelial cells that are on the inside of the blood vessel. Okay? So here within the blood vessel we have a high level of CO2 and a relatively low level of oxygen. The air that we breathe in is going to be what? High in oxygen, okay, and low in CO2. By when I say low in CO2, what am I talking about? When we say it has low CO2, what does that mean?
Doesn't have any more oxygen in it.
Well, it better have oxygen in it.
It's low compared to the amount of oxygen.
What do I mean by low, though? Low what? What is that? Low amount, right? It has a low concentration of carbon dioxide and oxygen. But what we're doing when we talk about concentrations, okay, when we talk about gases, we actually talk about partial pressure, okay? It's basically the same thing, right? When you talk about, water, a solution, an aqueous solution, right? And you put some salt in it, you could figure out how much salt goes in or what the concentration is of salt inside that solution, right? But in the air and in gases, we don't talk about the concentration of certain things. We talk about partial pressures. It's the same thing. All it means is that of the total 100% of the amount of gas you have, part of it's nitrogen, part of it is carbon dioxide, part of it is oxygen, okay? So we talk about partial pressures. So what you'll see in your book, and you'll see in the rest of the slides today, is you'll see something that looks like this, PCO2. What it's referring to is the pressure or the percentage, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the total amount of air, or the total solution of air that's there. Okay? So right here, when we talk about in the alveoli, the air we breathe in is going to have low CO2, okay, and high oxygen. What is that going to do? What process does those changes in partial pressures drive? What does it cause it to do? Emma, diffusion. Okay, so here, diffusion. Oxygen is going to be diffused from the alveoli to the red blood cells, and CO2 is going to leave the plasma of the blood and go to the CO2 that's in the alveolus. All right, and then that air will be exhaled off. That is external respiration. Okay, gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood. And that happens in all the capillaries that are surrounding the alveolus. Okay? And your body actually works so that this process is optimized. Okay? What do you want to have occur as the alveoli is inflated with new air? Fresh air. It has a high amount of oxygen, a low amount of CO2. We want this process to happen most efficiently. So what else do we have to have in that place? Blood has to be there, right? And so your body actually has worked to combine that process to occur. When the alveoli are inflated, perfusion, blood flow through the capillaries, is also at its maximal. Okay? So that blood flows through and you get this efficient diffusion process that occurs based upon the pressures, right? The percentages, the amount of gas that are on either side of the respiratory membrane. Clear? Okay, so here's number one, pulmonary ventilation. Air containing oxygen goes in, and kind of this puts all the different steps into a process. Okay? All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, that goes through the process. Why is this still up here? I don't know. Oh well. All right, so it goes through the process. All right, comes in, air, oxygen moves into the blood. Now, 1 and 8 are happening at the same time. 2 and 7 are happening at the same time. 3 and 6 are happening at the same time, as well as 4 and 5. Okay? That's why they're kind of looped together. These processes are coupled. They're moving at the same time, depending upon where it is. If we put it like this, shows you this picture over here. Okay? Again, O2 moves out is loaded really onto the red blood cell, and CO2 comes mostly from the plasma. All right? Most CO2 is actually transported via the plasma of the blood. Ew, no. I don't know. Why is this not working? Put that away. I don't care. What did I do? I screwed up. There we go. Okay. Questions? So, the first event is pulmonary ventilation. The second event is external respiration. And now that oxygen has been loaded onto the red blood cells, then that gas is transported to the tissues. So gas transport is a function of the blood in the cardiovascular system. Okay? And then we get to internal respiration, where we have tissues. Okay, we have tissues, tissue cells. Okay, those are cells. And we have the blood. Okay, and at this point, after going through the systemic circulation, what's the relative partial pressure of oxygen in the blood before it gets to the tissues? High or low? High, right? So we have high O2. What do we have here? Low CO2. And out here we have low O2. And because of all the different waste products, we have high CO2, right? Agree or disagree? So we're all set up. So now, depending upon the pressures or the concentration of oxygen, which way are the gases going to go? They're going to go according to their what? Their gradient. So oxygen moves off of hemoglobin into the tissues, and carbon dioxide moves into the plasma, and some of it is actually bound to hemoglobin as well. Okay? That is internal respiration. Okay? Where does the CO2 that builds up in tissues come from? Say it again. Cellular respiration. Okay? Cellular respiration is using the oxygen we're delivering to these tissues to burn glucose to produce ATP, and as that happens, we're producing CO2. Do not get cellular respiration confused with internal or external respiration. Okay? It's a different process. It happens within the cells. Okay? Questions on those 4 events? No? Yes? Maybe? Clear? You could draw it out for me. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the mechanics of breathing. Gave you the basic overview that, which kind of helps the situation, is that the thoracic cavity and the pleura, all right, the pleural membranes, the parietal and the visceral pleural membranes within the thoracic cavity, all right, they're kind of stuck together. So any change in the thoracic cavity would have the same effect on the lungs because they are stuck together. Okay? So this pulmonary ventilation is a completely mechanical process. Okay? There's no... It all depends upon this changing the volume and the size and the volume of the thoracic cavity. And by doing so, because you change the size of the thoracic cavity and it's attached or interacts with the pleura itself, you actually change the size, all right, and the volume of the lungs at the same time, as long as those 2 membranes are attached to one another. Okay? So, but when you lead to a volume change, it leads to a pressure change. Okay? So, what you end up with is this lovely interaction of what we call Boyle's law, where a volume, the initial volume, right, what we call volume 1 of a container, okay, has a certain pressure of that container, V1, P1. But when you change that volume, okay, a likewise change in pressure occurs. Okay? So then you end up with a volume 2 multiplied by, then leads to a difference in pressure 2. V1 P1 equals V2 P2. Okay? Let me give you an example. Okay? I take Casey's water bottle here, and if it was empty, it would have a certain volume, right? It has a finite capacity. Let's say 700 mils. If it was empty, it would have 700 mils of air inside. Yes? Okay. Now, that has a finite volume and a finite pressure. The volume with 700 mils, the pressure being atmospheric pressure. Let's just call it 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Now I squeeze this, what am I doing to the volume? I'm decreasing it. What happens to the pressure? It increases. Okay? Similar things are happening in the lungs. Okay? In this case, I'm decreasing volume and increasing pressure. What's going to happen when the diaphragm flattens and the thoracic cavity actually expands? And the dotted line is the original volume of the lungs. What happens to pressure? It goes down. Increase in volume, decrease in pressure. Okay? Increase in volume, decrease in pressure. And all right, and then when you relax, it goes back to here. You decrease volume and increase pressure. Okay? But how does that happen? Is it a completely closed system? Yes or no? What's the opening to the outside? The trachea. And just like your water bottle here, you have an opening. So if I was to take the cap off, I'm not going to, right? And I increase the size, all right, increase pressure, where does air go? Out. And then I relieve the pressure. Pressure inside goes below atmosphere, air goes in. Okay? That is the basics of how air moves in and out. It's all about changes in volume as opposed due to mechanics, the contraction of muscles, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Okay, those two muscles will change or increase the volume of the thoracic wall, of the thoracic cavity. Increased volume, decreased pressure, air moves in. All right, and therefore mammals are negative pressure breathers. They produce a pressure below atmosphere in order to pull air into the lung. Okay? That is one phase of breathing. Okay? So we have inspiration is inhalation. That is an active process. Okay, and it includes the muscles, the diaphragm, R-A-G-H-M, and the external intercostal muscles. Where are intercostal muscles? Caleb's pointing to it. Yes, not everyone can see you, Caleb, but where are they? Between the ribs. Inter means between, costals refer to ribs. Okay? You have both external and internal. Okay? Expiration, moving air out, is what? Is a passive process. Why is it passive? What happens after you inhale air, you stop the innervation, and then now the diaphragm stops contracting. It goes back to a relaxed state. And the thoracic cavity, because of its elasticity, you inhale, it gets bigger, you relax, the diaphragm goes back and pulls the sides of the rib cage back together, right? The intercostals relax and go back. It forces air out. Okay? So exhalation is mainly a passive process. You can exhale beyond normal. You're sitting here, normal breathing, in and out, what we call quiet breathing or quiet inspiration, expiration. Okay? It's active for the diaphragm and the external intercostals. You can forcibly exhale, where that would then recruit the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles for expiration. Okay? So internal intercostals are important for expiration. Okay, so here's some of the muscles that are involved. Okay, there's also some muscles of the back that are involved. Serratus anterior, the transversus thoracis, and so on. All right, but the two big ones jump.
Can you please explain the main difference between the two, the active and passive again?
You tell me.
I'm asking.
Okay, so why is it active?
I don't know.
What has to happen? What's an active process?
Something's happening.
Okay, what happens during inspiration? What has to happen?
Diaphragm expands.
The diaphragm does what?
It rises.
It doesn't rise, it flattens.
Flat.
Okay? And when it flattens, the diaphragm is a U-shaped muscle. Okay? And that's really the base of the thoracic cavity, is this U shape. And when it flattens, it pushes the sides out. Okay? That flattening is a contraction of the muscle. So that's an active process. Okay? So in order for inspiration to occur, the diaphragm has to contract and flatten to increase the size of the thorax. Now, the passive process occurs when the diaphragm relaxes. So it relaxes and goes back to its U shape. Okay? When it goes back to its U shape, it pushes it pulls the thoracic walls in and pushes the lungs up. That decreases the size of the thoracic cavity, pushing air out. So the passive process is a relaxation of those muscles, right? The active process is a contraction of the muscles. Okay? So inspiration, diaphragm, and external intercostals are involved. The size of the thoracic cavity increases. External air is pulled in, right? Because you end up with a decrease in not gas pressure, but really intrapulmonary pressure. Okay? And that ends up a decrease below what? We call atmospheric pressure. Okay? What I mean by atmospheric pressure is what's outside, external to you. Okay? Here's a nice little picture showing you what's happening, giving you an example in terms of the size of the thoracic cavity as a cube or trapezoidal, three-dimensional trapezoid. All right? Inspiration, you increase the size, air is pulled in. So the diaphragm contracts, vertical dimensions, right? So we not only expand the chest up, but also out. Excuse me. Okay? The sternum rises, and you get expansion of the chest. All right? During expiration, passive process, the diaphragm no longer contracting. It goes back to its relaxed U shape, and it allows the thoracic cavity to go back to its starting size, increases pressure within the thoracic cavity because the volume is decreasing and air is pushed out. Okay, so it's a passive process. Quiet breathing, quiet expiration is a passive process. If I asked you all to take a nice big deep breath in and then blow it out, right, forcibly or beyond normal, then that would be an active process where you're recruiting the abdominals and the internal intercostals to forcibly make the thoracic cavities smaller in volume in order to exhale air. Okay, again, decrease in intrapulmonary volume, and we'll say this is an increase in intrapulmonary pressure. Okay. Questions on expiration and inhalation and the mechanics involved. Without, I want to include this disclaimer, without the pleural membranes interacting together with the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, this doesn't happen. Okay? If those two membranes are not kind of stuck together due to the surface tension of serous fluid, changes in the thoracic cavity aren't going to be associated with changes in lung volumes. Because they are associated and they're attached, that allows these changes to occur. Okay? So here's a little graph showing you kind of the relationship between pressure and volume. Okay? So what's happening here? So pressure, the top graph. Pressure goes down, that means air is moving in, and it will come back to zero. What I mean by zero, or this relative pressure, it's pressure relative to atmosphere, the outside. So before your breath starts, it's at zero. It goes down below atmosphere, and then comes back to atmosphere. There's no air movement. Now the thoracic cavity begins to contract, or not contract, but get smaller in size, decrease in size. Air starts to move out, right? And you have pressure above atmosphere. Air moves out, and then it returns back to equal before the next breath. Okay? And the volume of breath, air moved in or out, okay, is the maximum after inhalation, right? After inhaling and before exhaling. So it meets maximum there. Okay, so if you were to inhale in and pause, that would the pressures would be equal outside, okay, but the volume of breath would be the highest. Okay, so the normal pressure within the pleural space is always negative. Negative in relationship to what? It's not a negative pressure, it's always negative with respect to the lungs and in respect to atmosphere. Okay? So it's always intrapleural pressure should, in a normal situation, always be less than intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, so this should always be greater than, that's a greater than. Okay, and these differences keep the lungs from collapsing. All right, so if you disrupt that pleural pressure and you make it equal to atmosphere, right, now that it's no longer negative, it's not below the intrapulmonary pressure, and now the pressure on the outside of the pleural cavity is greater than within the lungs. So with that increase in pressure, the lungs now deflate. Okay, they collapse. All right, and that's what a collapsed lung is. Okay, so, and that is related to the thoracic wall having, okay, so here's your thoracic cavity, and you have the parietal pleural, or the lungs inside of the thoracic cavity. Okay, anytime, these are usually the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, they're attached, right? They're stuck together. Okay, but sometimes if you disrupt that, you end up with a disruption in the pressure, and you disrupt how these membranes are associated, and you end up with some air inside here. Okay, that can disrupt that. That's called a pneumothorax. Yes?
A couple slides ago, you told us that intrapulmonary pressure is greater than pleural pressure.
Pleural or interpleural pressure? There's going to be changes.
What's the difference between intra and inter?
So interpleural is between the two. Okay, so if we talk about intrapulmonary is within the lungs. Okay? Interpleural is between the lungs and the thoracic cavity.
Have you written interpleural at any point on this? I've just been writing intrapleural the whole time. I don't know if I just didn't see it right, or I wrote it wrong, or because like a couple slides ago, I wrote intrapulmonary is greater than.
I've probably been using them like intra and interpleural simultaneously as synonyms. It really doesn't matter. Intra or inter, they're the same thing. And when you talk about pleural pressure, okay? So, what you should be, Colin, listen to me and forget about it. Okay, so listen. The interpleural pressure, the pleural pressure, the pressure between the lungs and the thoracic cavity, that area, should be less than, always be less than intrapulmonary pressure.
So the lungs should have more pressure, so they don't.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay?
So.
Do not be confused with the language. Understand the concept.
Yeah.
Okay? So you understand the pressure that's in this area, okay, that's in between the lungs and the cavity needs to be lower than what is within the lungs in order for the lungs to stay inflated. Okay? But when you introduce air in between there, you end up with what's called a pneumothorax. And in this place right here, in that air, this is equal to atmospheric pressure. ATM is atmospheric pressure. Yes?
Can you repeat that one more time?
What?
Just the pleural is supposed to be lower than the space in between the lungs and the cavity is supposed to be lower than the pressure
Within the lungs.
within the lungs. Okay.
All right, so the pressure within the lungs, number one, okay, should always be higher than the pressure of number two. Emma.
On there you said intrapleural is greater. No, it's up at the top.
Yeah, it says
Intrapleural is greater than intrapulmonary. But it should be intrapulmonary. is
Yeah, this should be-
greater than Intrapleural.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I was confused because when you had written like.
Don't forget that. That's my.
On that one, you corrected the wrong one.
Okay.
So I just
Okay. Are we clear?
I'm done.
Is that? I want to make, before we move on, I want to clear up any confusion. Okay?
Higher than the pressure we have.
The pressure within the lungs. All right. the pressure within the lungs should be higher than what's inside the cavity so that they can stay inflated. When you disrupt that, right? When you disrupt that, you end up with a collapsed lung.
Okay.
Right? In this case, this is a pneumothorax, which could lead to that. And you can also have a hemothorax, which can also lead to that. Right? That's blood that builds up in between the pleural membrane. Mike.
What would cause a pneumothorax?
Any like injury, so if you fall and break a rib, okay, and that rib goes into the lungs, okay, and if there's an open fracture, open to the outside, air can move in there, right, and that can cause air to move in between the pleural space. Maybe that rib doesn't puncture the lung, but it punctures that cavity or that pleural membrane, and that can cause air to move in there, and that would change the pressure within the cavity right there, in that small area. If it goes across the whole side of the side of that lung, that could cause the lung to collapse. So a pneumothorax is a small portion of it, which then reduces the size of the lung, but it could lead to the full lung collapsing. Okay? Other questions? Okay, so here's your atmospheric pressure. Okay, so atmosphere, alveolar pressure, and then here you see the pleural cavity. The pressure within the pleural cavity is below that of what's inside of the lungs. Okay, this right here, why is it equal? Why is the pressure inside the lung equal to atmospheric pressure? Read the bottom. What does it say? At the end of an expiration. At the end of an expiration, those pressure changes equilibrium has been reached. So that's equal from the intrapulmonary pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure. So there's no net movement of air. Understand? So that's why those two are equal. All right? And this picture shows the pressure as it goes through. If you notice, and we'll go through this to clear up the confusion. Okay? So 756. Let's compare in each of these boxes. Pleural pressure or intrapleural pressure to intrapulmonary pressure. The pressure within the cavity versus the pressure within the lungs. Number one, the pressure within the cavity is less than the pressure in the lungs. Number two, the pressure within the cavity is less than the pressure within the lungs. Number three, the pressure within the cavity is less than the pressure in the lungs. Number four, the pressure within the cavity is less than the pressure within the lungs. The lungs are always inflated because of that difference in pressure. And this shows the differences in where above or below atmosphere. Okay? So, in this case, in number two, what's happening? Air is moving in because the pressure within the lungs, 759, is below atmosphere, 760. Air moves in. In number four, air is moving out because the pressure within the lungs, 761, is above atmosphere. Air moves out. Okay? And that is all related to the changes in the volume of the thoracic cavity. Okay? All right. So on Socrative, there's a quiz. There's a couple questions that you can't answer because we didn't get through everything. Okay? But go through and do that now before you leave.